Welcome to the Explainer. So, let's start with a feeling I think we all know a little too well. Your heart is racing, your palms are sweaty, and there is a clock just relentlessly ticking on the wall. We have all experienced test anxiety. But have you ever paused to think about the invisible architecture behind that test? I mean, how are these exams actually built? And what are they genuinely trying to measure? Today, we're unpacking the fascinating blueprint of language assessment, drawing straight from Asian Pocketee's really comprehensive research in language testing and assessment. We're going to look under the hood of how these tests are designed and, importantly, why they hold so much power in our society.
Okay, let's dive into this. We're going on a 5-part journey today, starting with testing versus assessment, then defining the language construct, comparing assessment approaches, the stages of test design, and finally, the social power of tests.
All right, part 1, testing versus assessment.
So think about this for a second. Is there actually a difference between a test and an assessment? For a lot of us, these words are totally interchangeable. But picture that universal memory of sitting in a dead silent exam room with a proctor pacing up and down the aisles. Now contrast that with having a super casual check-in with a teacher where they just gently correct a word you mispronounced. These are actually two very different things.
Our source material has a brilliant analogy for this. When you go to the doctor, you ask for a blood test, right? Not a blood assessment. The test is the specific, standardized, highly formal tool. It's your IELTS or your TOEFL exam, designed to collect information in a really controlled way. Language assessment, on the other hand, is the much wider umbrella. It includes those formal tests, absolutely, but it also includes all those informal, daily evaluations, like a teacher implicitly correcting a student's grammar during a normal classroom chat. Basically, testing is the specific tool, but assessment is the whole shebang.
Moving right along to part 2, defining the language construct.
So what exactly are we trying to measure? Well, in the field of language assessment, we're trying to measure a construct. Yeah, I know, it sounds like heavy academic jargon, but it's actually a super fascinating concept. A construct is simply an abstract idea that you literally cannot observe directly. Think about it. A teacher can't magically peer inside your brain to see if you understand subject-verb agreement. No way. Instead, they have to infer your hidden knowledge by systematically watching your behavior. When you speak or write, you leave clues. The construct is your hidden ability. And the test? The test is just how we get you to leave those clues.
To figure out how we actually measure these invisible constructs, we look at Bloom's taxonomy. When test designers decide what construct to measure, they really have to look at the complexity of the thinking required. Bloom's taxonomy is essentially a pyramid of cognitive processes. We start way down at the bottom with basic remembering, like, can you just recall a fact? Then we step up to understanding the meaning, applying it to a totally new problem, analyzing its parts, evaluating or critiquing performance, all the way up to creating. Creating is the absolute highest order where you produce a completely new, original piece of work. And the rule of thumb? You generally can't tackle the higher steps without mastering the lower ones first. So how does this theory actually hit the real world? Well, for an assessment to truly work, there has to be a flawless alignment between the learning outcome, the teaching activity, and the final test. If a teacher just wants you to remember factual info, while the assessment simply targets that remembering level, it tests basic facts. But if the goal is for you to write a summary with examples, the assessment suddenly leaps up to demand the creating level. That requires complex procedural and metacognitive knowledge, which is really just a fancy way of saying you need to know how to plan, monitor, and execute a complex task. The test must perfectly match the intended outcome.
Which brings us to part 3, comparing assessment approaches.
Every time someone designs a test, they have to make a huge decision right up front. Is this assessment formative or summative? Formative assessment is assessment for learning. This is entirely feedback-focused. It happens midstream, like a teacher throwing out a quick pop quiz to diagnose if the class actually understands the material so they can adjust their teaching tomorrow. Summative assessment, though, is assessment of learning. This is outcome-focused. It's that massive final exam at the end of the term that officially evaluates your achievement. To put it simply, formative helps you grow, while summative judges where you landed.
And once you actually take the test, how do they score it? Well, there are 2 distinct ways. In a norm-referenced approach, you are literally being compared to everyone else in the room. Think of grading on a classic bell curve. It uses percentiles to rank students, which is usually what happens when there are limited spots, like competing for a single scholarship. But a criterion-referenced approach? It honestly doesn't care how the rest of the room did. It compares your scores strictly to a standard cutoff. If a university says they require an IELTS band of 7 and you get a 7, you're in. And that's regardless of whether everyone else in the room got a 4 or a 9.
All right, part 4, stages of test design. Let's build one.
Here is the first half of the test construction lifecycle. It all starts with planning, figuring out the core purpose, the resources you have, and exactly who the test takers are. Then comes designing, where we build the specifications. From there, we move to creating, which is the actual writing of the test items. And before anyone ever takes it officially, there is piloting and revising. This is running simulations to see if the questions are too easy, too hard, or just plain confusing. And keep in mind, this is an incredibly iterative process. Tweaking just one single question in the piloting stage can force designers to go all the way back and adjust their initial planning.
Now, right in the middle of that process is something absolutely crucial: the blueprint, or as it's formally called, the test specifications. You can't just throw a bunch of experts in a room and tell them to write questions. You need a generative blueprint. This document tells task writers precisely what is and is not allowed. It dictates the number of sections, the exact time limits, the sequence, and the specific question formats. It's essentially the source code that ensures every single version of the test measures the exact same construct fairly.
And that leads us into the second half of the life cycle. Actually administering the test requires strict uniformity and security. Think of proctors checking IDs and even regulating the room temperature so everyone has the exact same physical conditions. Then comes scoring, relying heavily on answer keys or super strict rubrics for things like essays. That data then feeds into decision-making. Do they pass? Do they fail? Are they admitted? And finally, reporting and feedback, where the grades and official transcripts are delivered back to everyone involved.
Finally, part 5, the social power of tests.
So here's the really crucial takeaway from all of this. Language tests aren't just harmless, isolated academic exercises. They carry immense socio-political weight. Our source material highlights that historically, tests have actually been used as a means of control by authorities. They are incredibly high-stakes gatekeepers. Your performance on one single Tuesday morning can determine your eligibility for immigration, your chances of getting a job, or your admission into university. The authority to design a test is, in many ways, the authority to dictate a person's future.
And the research points out some pretty major unintended social consequences. Strict, standardized assessments can inadvertently disadvantage specific minority or socioeconomic groups who might simply lack the same test prep resources. Tests can unintentionally force schools to narrow down their curriculum, leading teachers to teach to the test rather than exploring the broader subject. They can even influence national policies, like tying government funding directly to a school's test performance. Plus, you have the ongoing challenges of bias from human raters grading spoken exams, or computer AI raters completely missing the nuanced context of human social interaction. So, test design goes far beyond just writing questions. It directly interacts with our social structures.
And that brings our blueprint to a close. We've gone from the invisible mental constructs all the way up to global societal impacts. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Think back to the major tests you have taken in your own life. How have those specific assessments, those gatekeepers, shaped your personal path, your career, or your opportunities? Once you realize the massive structural power behind that ticking clock in the exam room, you really never look at a test the same way again. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the systems around you.